to this very important workshop discussing a diagnosis with your child. My name is Natalie Healy. I'm an intake service coordinator here at Surrey Place, and together with my co-worker Lisa Nelson, we will be facilitating this session with you today. We are so happy that you're here. Here's a very quick look at our agenda today. If we're doing this live or if we're in person today, we would do introductions, introduce ourselves, and share a little bit about ourselves. Our session today is going to cover all the reasons that we'd want to share a diagnosis with our child or loved one. We'll talk a little bit about timing. So when is the best time to share? When is the child ready? When is the parent ready? When is the caregiver ready? The family, whenever the family's ready. And then we look a little bit about where we share it, why we share it, and a little bit around the environment. We're going to talk a little bit also about, the strengths of sharing a diagnosis. We're going to talk a little bit about creating some context and getting prepared, looking at what those discussions are going to look like, about the timing, and that maybe and possibly these discussions might not all happen in one sit down. We'll discuss and look at managing reactions, and we'll also take a good look at who to share with. Who do we share this diagnosis with? So we present this workshop in 3 different ways. We do it in person. We also pre-record this workshop so that individuals can just select it and watch it at their own leisure. And then we also do a live session on Zoom or through the internet. So this slide here is a little bit tricky because if we were in person, we would open up a conversation about where we are in our sharing our child's diagnosis. Maybe some of us have started the conversation with some of our children. Maybe we're just getting ready to start discussing it. And it's always nice to learn from each other's experiences. But if we're not in person today, I'd like for you to take a moment and write down quickly what it is that you are most hoping to get out of today's session. There is no denying that this topic is tricky. There's no denying that this topic is full of emotion and sometimes uncertainty and for sure some level of fear. But we're going to go through these next slides and just try and discuss all sides of this topic. And I would like to be open and transparent and honest and let you know that I will present this information from the perspective that I personally feel like it's a good idea or a positive thing to share a diagnosis with an individual. But I do also think it's important that we look at age and how we share the information and be sure the child or individual is ready to hear the information, because it's filled with a lot of information that can be tricky to understand, particularly if an individual doesn't really feel that they are different or that who they are is anything but perfect. So in regards to research on this topic, there isn't a lot. Most of the research is based on health, so sharing a health diagnosis. If a child was not well or had, say, diabetes, for instance, how to share that information. There's a lot more information out there on that type of thing. But in doing this workshop, we have looked at talking to adults or to individuals that have that know about their diagnosis and how that felt and how that made their lives easier or better, or sometimes complicated for a period of time. But we also sort of base it on child development and how at a certain age, individuals are really trying to find their identity and figure out who they are. So that was a big piece of putting this information together as well. I know that personally I've worked in this field for almost 17 years, and I know that families that I've worked with and who had chosen to share a diagnosis, for the most part, I would say that it helped their child sometimes immensely to understand some of the difficulties that they were going through. Another thing I can share with you on a personal note is that I have a sibling who now is on the spectrum and understands what that means, and absolutely feels that he understands a lot of the whys in his life. So why did he not enjoy spending a lot of time with people? Why was it hard for him to hold down a job? Why did he not have a lot of friends? So on and so forth. So the main point of this entire workshop is to help you to decide if now or if ever you plan to share this diagnosis with your child. You may decide after this session that you're not ready, and that's okay, because every child is different, every family is different, and every situation is different. So I really encourage you to keep that in mind. And, you know, I said it earlier, and I think I'll say it again, that, you know, timing and your child's level of understanding is very, very important. But perhaps today you will find a way to put all the information together and find a place to maybe start about what the journey will look like. Perhaps you're looking for the right words, or you're looking for, you know, somebody else's perspective, or perhaps you needed to hear stories and more information before you were able to think about moving forward. As I had mentioned before, I have a sibling who I was part of the process in him understanding his diagnosis, and also I am the mother of 2 boys who are adopted, and it has been very beneficial for my boys to know from the very beginning that they are adopted. It's really quite normal for our family and for them. And so you know, I come from a place of telling the truth is always best. So let's start off by talking about some of the difficulties that might bubble up or might appear should we decide not to share a diagnosis, and maybe what the long-term impact on some of those things might be. So the first thing that comes to mind is that if somebody is not aware of their own needs, then it is impossible to self-advocate. And so that's just the first thing that comes to mind for me, that they don't have a good, if your child doesn't have a good sense of who they are and where their strengths and needs lie, and that they have a diagnosis or a special need of some kind, particularly when it comes to their education or their work environment, how do we expect them to be able to advocate? Also, I think that sometimes if we don't understand what our limitations are, then we can sometimes think that we're always not good enough. And sometimes those things can really have us feeling isolated, feeling left out, and having low self-esteem, which then may lead to more difficult things like mental health, or increased, or the sort of anxiety, or those types of things. Children may be curious and confused about the assessment process and the treatment they're involved in if they don't understand why they're doing it. So, they go and they have this testing done, or they're pulled out of school and they're having testing done, but they don't really understand why that's happening. And I don't know, personally, I think that would feel a little bit scary or uncertain. So these are just some things for us to think about. Sometimes when there is a secret and it's not shared and it comes out, a family secret, something that we don't share with others, and then later something surfaces and we become resentful, and then someone would say, well, how are we to know? You never told us. I mean, that is just something to keep in mind as well, that carrying a secret about something or someone that you love and care for so much can be very, very heavy on our hearts and in our lives. And then, of course, there's the accidental disclosure, where the child doesn't know that they have a diagnosis, and suddenly, it's disclosed in a conversation in a classroom, or, at a kitchen table while children are in another room. And I certainly have heard or been privy to that sort of information and those stories, and they can happen. So this is just a slide for us to kind of think of those things. I'm assuming, and I bet most of you already thought about many of these as a parent, but I thought it would be nice for us just to break them down and take a look at them. So when to share? I'm a parent, and I know that I can say that I love my children very, very, very much, and my instinct is to protect them. So when we are in a situation where we have a diagnosis, or we have something we need to tell our children, or when there's an event that happens in life that can be hard for our children, like a death in our family, or something like that, or maybe somebody that we're really close to, a grandma or grandpa that gets sick. As parents, we really have to be mindful of what is the best way to be able to share that information with our children. And then if our children are, nonverbal, or if our children have a diagnosis of autism, and, maybe their receptive language is difficult for them, then we have to really just think about how we're going to share the information. But, parents need time to process the diagnosis as well. So currently I'm working with the little ones, so children 0 to 6. And so a lot of my job, my current role, is supporting parents through a new diagnosis. And it's tough. It's very, very hard. I feel very lucky to spend time with families and be able to hold space for them while they ask those questions and process the information. It can be a scary time, and there's a lot to take in. So obviously, you as a parent or caregiver, you need to be ready. You need to find time to be able to process the information and understand how it feels and what that means, and how you're going to move forward with it before we can even talk about whether your child's ready. So parent readiness is number one. Of course, that's just in my opinion, but I truly believe that. I think that we also need to look at family dynamic, how a family is what it looks like, a nuclear family, whether there's 2 parents, 1 parent, second marriages, new families. Sometimes our in-laws, an extended family, don't agree, and this can be really hard to navigate sometimes. So if we're a 2-parent family, then we both need to be ready, and we both need to agree and pick the language that we're going to choose. Sometimes we work with families and parents are not together but have access to the children, so there's a rotation of custody. And so, for example, mom is ready, but dad is like, no way are we sharing this information with this little guy. And so, wow, that's complicated. How do we navigate that? How do we make the decision? It's so important that we're on board and together and sharing the information. And even if you aren't ready to share yet, it is always good to think about what you'd like to say in case it comes up.
because as we know, these kids, they may have a diagnosis of autism, and as we know, it's a spectrum, but they ask hard questions and they ask real questions and true questions. So it's always nice, if you haven't shared yet and you're not sure when, to sort of have something in the back of your mind so that you're not caught off, and that you're prepared for that. That's some advice I'd like to share with you. Okay, so we've talked about parent readiness, and so now we're here, and possibly now we have digested as much as we can about our child's diagnosis, and we may have all sorts of different feelings, but we're going to talk about your child's readiness. And so I'm going to talk about some of the things to consider. Child readiness looks different for everyone. So please take whatever information seems to resonate from this session, but always know, just like anything else, your child is your child, and every child is different, and it's really important to think about some of the following things where it applies to your child. So a good indication if a child is ready to learn about something is if they ask the question. A really wise person told me some time back when I was adopting children, I said, when would be a good time to tell my children? And she said, talk about it always, as if it is not something to be ashamed of, but rather to be proud of in some sense. But then leave that information there, and as your child or children ask questions, you answer them. Don't give too much information, don't give too little information, and if they're asking questions, please try to be truthful. And so I have gone back to that conversation with that doctor so many times throughout my life, raising my own boys and working with kids with special needs really for most of my life. So if your child is asking a question, chances are they're ready for a little bit of information on that topic. And the next point is are they showing that they have a sense of being different, or comparing themselves to others? I ran social skills groups for kiddos with autism, and I had kids that would sort of, come over to me and say, I don't know about this group. These kids are kind of strange. And I'll never forget that girl. I mean, she just was completely unaware and glorious and oblivious to the fact that she was in this group for kids with special needs, and that it did not dawn on her that she had any kind of special needs. And so those are the tricky kind of kids, those are the kids that sometimes it can be difficult, but it's very difficult when, your child's coming home and they're constantly feeling like they're not measuring up, or that they're different, and that socially at every corner they just are not able to join in or be a part of or get along. That might be a time you consider sharing the diagnosis or your child's needs at that time. Is it important for them to know because possibly they're having difficulty with coping? There's a time where now self-management and self-regulation and those types of things are becoming a problem, or getting away in the way of their daily life, or even possibly their safety. Sometimes when we're scared or we don't know the answers, we act out, and usually that acting out behavior is usually communication, and sometimes it can be fear. And so you want to look for those indicators, those times in your child's life that maybe it's time to slowly but surely start explaining some of the reasons why, and then replacing that with some strategies and some love and some care, so that they don't have to go through life with such difficulty. We know that you know, we start talking a little bit about these things, and things around their identity come up, usually around from age 5 until preteen. I know personally with my own boys, their identity questions and things came out at 9 and then 11. And they were profound, they were strong. They really had a lot of questions about where did they come from, who did they come from. One of my boys also has a learning disability, and, you know, he just came home one day and said, why am I different? And, you know, I go back to that wonderful doctor who said if he's asking the questions, it's time to start sharing some of the answers. So those are some of the things to keep in mind when we start thinking about readiness for our kiddos. Okay, so now we're probably thinking about picturing, thinking, how am I going to do this? Where is it going to happen? Who's going to be with us? Where will I start? You know, and where will it happen? Will it be planned? Will it be spontaneous? You know, do you set a date for something like this? Once you know that you're ready, and once you feel that it's time that your child's ready, and or that it's important to share the diagnosis and the information, then, you know, I think it's good for everyone to think about where that will happen and when, and be sure that you have enough time. Make sure you have enough space. Make sure you're in a safe space. Make sure you're in a space with others who can be supportive and are on the same, you know, that know the plan and have the same agenda. And I think that it's important to be sure that you have time to start and finish the conversation, because you just really don't know how it will go. Sometimes we think, oh, this is going to be so difficult, and it's smooth sailing. Kids surprise us. Other times we think it's going to go well, and it can be a disaster. I think that also with, you know, we're focusing on sharing a diagnosis of autism or special needs or developmental disabilities. We have to talk about accommodations. How are we going to share the information so that our child or loved one understands? Do we need pictures? Do we need a book? Do we need to show a film? These are all the types of things that we need to think about. And it's not just, hey, by the way, you have autism, and do you have any questions, right? I'm not making light of it, but really there is some planning that needs to go into it. And I think also, just like ourselves as parents, our kiddos need time to process it. And you may find that you need to go back to it and revisit the conversation once they've had time to process it and think about it a little bit. So, you know, be mindful of those things, and try to be as ready as you possibly can, and maybe think about what environment is best for your child. Are they most comfortable when they're in the outdoors, and maybe you can go for a hike, and there's a place that sometimes you'll stop and talk? That might be a nice place. Home for most of us is most safe. I feel that way. You know, right now with my eldest son, most of our conversations, because he's a teenager, happen in the car. Otherwise, he doesn't really talk to me much. So, you know, you just think about the environment, think of where this might take place. And I think it would be helpful to have that planned ahead of time. So while we share a diagnosis with our kids, our children, our loved ones, sometimes it's difficult to think about all the positive things about our children, because the diagnosis and the fear of the future you know, the struggles and the barriers and the behaviors sometimes are just at the forefront, and we forget what amazing kids we have. And you know, there's a funding form that we all fill out, and it's a portion of that is tell me about the strengths of your child. And sometimes parents just freeze. They don't see always the strengths and the beautiful gifts that our kids have. You know, I always tell the families I work with, these kids can be very difficult. And sometimes it's worse, and sometimes things get better. But I know that these children have beautiful gifts, and they're there, even though sometimes it's hard for us to see them. But let's take a moment, and on that same piece of paper where you wrote down what you hope to get from today's session, let's take a moment and think about the strengths that you see in your child, and some of the strengths and benefits that might be associated with this diagnosis. I know for my brother, he's an incredible painter. He worked for a long time painting planes, and he knows every single thing you could ever wonder about Easter Island. That's his area of interest. He loves music, and he's very organized. Some may say he's OCD. I see that he has got lots and lots of life skills, and people used to love to hire him as a painter because he did such a perfect job. And once the job was done, he would clean up afterwards so well. So, you know, this is something, he doesn't work full time anymore because other things have caused him to, it's difficult for him because his anxiety is quite severe as he's aged. But he always has a job or a way to make extra money in his back pocket. So that's not always something that we look at, right? When we're looking at our children and we're looking at academics and school, you know, maybe our kids are not the best English marks, or, you know, maybe math is really difficult for them, or maybe school just really overall just sucks for our kids. A school environment is tough. It's very, very, very tough. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of smells. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of transitions. We know that for our kiddos that are on the spectrum, this is really, really difficult. But if we're really to look at some of the gifts that our children have, what does that look like? Let's take a minute and think about those for a sec.
Hi everyone, this is Lisa. I am Natalie's colleague, and I'm going to be taking over for the remainder of the presentation. So Natalie did a really great job going over you know, the reasons why we share, and I'm going to be giving some tips and some strategies on how we share the information with our child. The first section is about creating context, and really, you know, Natalie talked about a strength-based approach and thinking about your child's strengths from your perspective. We do think it's really important for your child to be able to think about all their strengths as well, and perhaps also identifying where they have some challenges and where are the areas that they need help. By them being able to identify the great things about them and the areas where they need assistance, it will really help them with their diagnosis and processing that, as well as being able to identify areas where they need to have self-efficacy. We do think it's important to use some real life examples so that they're able to conceptualize that their strengths and challenges, and kind of where Natalie spoke about her brother. He knows the things that he's very passionate about, that he's very good at. So those are the areas that are really easy to highlight for your child. So whether they're really into sports or they're really into trains, they are getting great marks in one class but not the other, or they're having difficulties navigating the social aspects of school. Just identifying these and having them kind of in the forefront allows your child to pick up that just because they have a diagnosis doesn't make them different or stand out. Kind of like everyone else, they have areas where are stronger than others. So that's where we want to start off with how to share. Moving on and discussing further with your child some of their strengths, we want to explore options that might really help the child connect to the diagnosis as well as their areas where they're very, strength focused. Some things that you might want to do to begin exploring your child's talents and personality could be going over social stories. This will allow them, to be able to connect to a general problem or their general strength, to know that, they're not alone in some of these things that are attributed to a diagnosis. If they have a lot of problems going out into the community, reading a social story about going to a store or going to a mall and how to navigate those difficulties will allow them to see that they're not the only people that are challenged with some of those tasks. I think, if you're looking for things that your child's really good at and highlighting their talents, you can also look at different social stories for that as well. But another really great option is, using visuals, or you could create a vision board. This is something that you and your child could work on together and kind of guide them to bring in all the things that they really enjoy or that they really like, identify some of their goals, and then it can also show where they feel like they need a little bit of help. And the vision board can be as big or as condensed as you would like it to be, but really kind of highlighting kind of different sections of your child that make them a whole. It's a really good visual way that they can, continue to come back at and also change and adapt as they grow. And it can be a really important piece that they carry with them. One other thing that having your child kind of think about their qualities in relation to a diagnosis can bring is that they can see how their traits are connected to the diagnosis in a positive way that they may have never thought of before. If they identify that they can remember facts really easily, or they've, know every subway platform in the city, or, they know 100 species of birds, this is something that you can attribute to autism or whatever diagnosis your child has potentially, and say, did you know that people with autism have this strength too? And that way it's having them connect to the diagnosis in a positive way. They're looking at what positive traits they have and that it is connected to the diagnosis. Another thing that you could do is sort of a Venn diagram, and it can explore how the diagnosis is, it overlaps with who they are, but that's not solely who they are. So it allows the child to see these are traits of autism, and these are traits of myself, and these are where they overlap. So by creating that type of visual, it does show that just having a diagnosis doesn't mean you're only a person with ASD, or, there's a lot more to you that makes you very unique and individualized, and not looking at the label solely. So on the next slide, I'll show you that in a visual context. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, this is the Venn diagram activity. So as you can see on the left-hand side is autism strengths and challenges. So, people with autism have a difficult time talking to people. They're very punctual. They have a great memory, and that they are scared of loud noises. On the right side is your child's strengths and challenges, or their own strengths and challenges. So they're friendly, they don't like cleaning up, they're smart, they're grumpy in the morning, and they're good at soccer. So those are all things that are unique to your child, and that they don't necessarily overlay with an autism diagnosis. So those, again, are all unique. They don't have anything to do with the ASD. And then in the middle, and the part that overlaps, would be autism strengths and challenges that are part of the child. So this could be anything that overlaps, from sensory to talents and strengths. So this is a good visual that you can do for your child, or that your child can do by themselves. And it could also be a good activity for both of you to do, so that you can see what your child feels are their strengths and challenges that don't overlap, as well as you might have some other things that they've never thought of that you can talk about once this activity has been done. I think it's really important at this point in our conversation with your child that it's not only about the diagnosis, but more about their self-identity. So by them identifying their challenges, I think it's highlighting the areas that they struggle with, and trying to make their lives a little bit easier. It's very difficult for anyone to accept help or accommodations, especially as a child. I can imagine that it would be very challenging to need special protocols put in place so that you are more successful. So I think one of the tools that you can use is really by normalizing the challenges, and that identifying that in some aspects of our life, we all need accommodations. When I think about my own needs, having a quiet workspace is very important for me. I mean, I would not be able to do this session right now if I did not have a quiet workspace. And the louder it would be, or if the more interruptions I had, I would be, further annoyed with how I'm outputting my work right now. So that's an accommodation that I'm even having right now. I've had to ask my children to leave me alone for a little while so that I could focus and get this done. That's my accommodation that I'm doing right now. You could also use celebrities or people your child admires. It could be a teacher, it could be a doctor, someone that is in their life that they really look up to, and talking to them about accommodations that they might need, and the special training that they would have to do, and to really practice to be such a great teacher or such a great doctor. Another option could be looking at some of the peers in their class that might have a diagnosis. And I do say this cautiously because it's important to first know if the child is aware of their own diagnosis and asking permission from the parents. But, it might come as a surprise to your child that other people in their class also have accommodations because of a diagnosis. And maybe that they need extra time to do their work, because they work at a slower pace. But identifying that they're not alone in some of their challenges and accommodations really helps them understand that they're not the only people that are going to need extra help. It really makes it more successful in their future to be able to identify this. I think trying to fix and redirect doesn't always work. So if you have time to explore with them what will happen when we accept help versus what will happen if we don't get help, that's a really important piece as well. So if they have a lot of anxiety during tests, and talking to them about what will happen if you have extra time, or if you have a quiet room to do your test in, versus just doing it in your class with the other 20 students. I think the other thing would be and exploring that, really identifying the solution. So what will be the best environment for you to do the test in, to be able to be successful in completing it with the least amount of anxiety. So I think these are all really great options to explore with your child, again, based on what type of information they can process, but helping to be the solution versus letting them navigate it alone. I think it will allow them to feel that you are on their side and that you're looking for kind of a reasonable accommodation to help them be the best that they can be. Take your time. So I know that might be a very basic principle, but I do want to highlight that when you are going to share and how to share, you are really going to want to take your time in having this conversation. These conversations really do not need to happen in a one-time approach. You may want to have small little sections over time so that you can revisit the conversation to help your child process what the diagnosis means. They are going to experience different emotions towards the conversations that you have. So I think it's important that, perhaps they might get angry or they might kind of be withdrawn. It's important to let them process those emotions as well. And if you give them that time that they can process the emotions, the conversations tend to be more rich when you are able to reapproach when they've dealt with the emotions personally. If you're sensing that a natural break is occurring, allow it to occur. It allows your child to not become overwhelmed with things that they're hearing. And you can always suggest a change in topic or a break if they feel uncomfortable or don't want to move forward. It's also important as your child gets older and is able to understand more of the complexities that are connected to the diagnosis, that you'll want to continue the discussion and make sure that they understand and are comfortable with the information that you've given them previously. It might also be, as they get older, they might have further questions that they might want to ask a health professional, a social worker, and this is also a really great tool that you could bring in understanding the diagnosis more with them, that they can ask some of questions that have more of a medical scope that maybe you're not comfortable in answering as a parent. It also has the ability to detach from the parent-child emotional bond and really looking at the diagnosis as from a more medical standpoint. And it gives, again, time for your child to process from just the parent's perspective and having them be able to talk about it with someone else who they perhaps trust in a different capacity. These are some other considerations that we want to bring up, while you're sharing the diagnosis with your child. We obviously think it's really important for you to explore what they think about the diagnosis once the conversation has been had, if there's anything that bothers them about the diagnosis, if they're feeling any stigma attached. Now that they know that, they have this label, talking about, again, strengths and the range of abilities that, each individual with a diagnosis and without a diagnosis has. You might also find that your child has a sense of belonging rather than a feeling of stigmatization. From here, self-advocacy and forging connections to, the disability community can really create a sense of control in their life. So that's important to explore as well. We know that language is a sensitive topic to some people. It's something that you may want to think about at the start of this journey. If you want to tell your child that they have a specific diagnosis or not. Some people have chosen not to label a diagnosis. And if this is important to you, we really consider you exploring what your child understands about the terms of special needs, disability, and disorder. These labels can carry both negative and positive reflections, and your child will hear them through different environments that they're connected to, whether it's at the doctor's office or school, and other friends. So you can choose the diagnostic term or just identify that they have areas of challenge, and explore, all of the terminology and language that does come with a diagnosis, and that, you're comfortable in your child hearing that as they navigate through other areas of their life. In this part of the presentation, we're going to move to talking about managing reactions from your child. These can reflect a full range of responses. Some will have many questions, while others will want to do their own research, and some will really just be resistant and want their own space. So we do think that many of these reactions are likely to occur in some form if you do or do not share the diagnosis with your child. It can be easier for your child to come to terms with some of the differences and challenges that they are facing when they are aware and have kind of processed their own diagnosis. So the first area that we're going to speak about is denial. So this would be when your child's saying, I don't want to talk about it, I wish you never told me. If they're denying what they've been told or kind of just blocking it out, your child may not want to talk about it. And if that's the case, we would always want you to honor their feelings, suggest resources for them to turn to when they feel ready. It could also be something like leaving a resource on the table or pamphlet, so that when they're able to read a little bit more and do their own research, that they can do that on their own. You can also provide explanations and context when it's appropriate. So, perhaps something is said at the dining table and you're just able to talk a little bit about it. So these small steps and conversations can help normalize their feelings and really encourage them to connect when they're ready to talk about what they're going through. I think the biggest gift that you can give your child is respecting their own process as they form their new identity. So just in the same way that parents would have to work through a new diagnosis of their child in different stages that they're going through, your child is going to have their own journey, and we highly encourage supporting it at every step that they're going through. We're now moving on to distress, anger, and blame in managing reactions from your child. An example of this would be if your child is saying that they hate themselves because of the diagnosis, or they hate you because you've told them this information. It's not an easy emotion to work through as a parent. I know that, when my child has become mad and said kind of hurtful things, it's typically not something that they've processed, and it's been very sudden. And so I think the first thing is to not take this personally. One of the other things that typically will happen is if your child perceives that you kept the diagnosis from them for an extenuated period of time, that can really correlate with this emotion. So tip number one would be, don't try to fix them from being angry. Anger is a typical emotion that we all feel, and this is a big change in their life. It's very difficult for some children to hear that they have a diagnosis, so we want you to allow them to feel whatever it is that they're going through, and that they really attempt to work through these emotions. It could take hours, it could take days, but it is important to give them some time. A helpful way is to get them to expand on what they're thinking and feeling. Saying I hate you or that they hate themselves isn't very constructive. It doesn't help them work through the emotion. So again, let them be angry, but perhaps getting them to expand beyond that. What is it that you're so frustrated with? And I know that this is big news, but can we talk about it a little bit further? Tell me what you're thinking. And then when the opportunity presents itself, really kind of working through and redirecting back to strength. So I know that this is tough, but I noticed this about you, and this is, I know that you can do this, and that's a really great strength that you have. Again, this is a process that your child is going to have to navigate through in the same way that you've worked through receiving the diagnosis. Showing support and patience will really empower them for success and self-actualization. I think that it's something that we want to kind of sweep away. We don't want your child feeling distress or anger or blame. And as a parent, that's a very common solution. But again, I think that by allowing them to work through it will really create a better sense of self and be able to work through it a little bit easier in the future. There are two more reactions that we want to cover in this presentation. The first one being depression. So you may notice that your child, after you've had the discussion of their diagnosis, becoming more withdrawn, perhaps they're more negative in their speech, or you just notice that something is different, that they're not seeming to find joy in the things that they used to. It's always, available for clinical involvement to play a part in working through these reactions with your child. So whether it's with a psychologist or a psychiatrist, a counselor, it might be that an outside view is needed to help your child with dealing with their new diagnosis and managing those emotions that they're working through. And reaching out could be a valuable option for your child to help guide them during this kind of new self-identity. The last reaction that might happen is that your child might start to use the label of a diagnosis as an excuse for bad or perhaps not their best behavior. What this might look like is they would say, I can't do that because I have an intellectual disability, or I just can't make friends because I have autism. So to help manage this reaction, we encourage the use of behavioral strategies and to stay firm on what the expectations of your child are. Something that help, really kind of nip this before it becomes a big problem is to ensure that all environments that your child is participating in, whether it be school, home, sports, maybe a club, that everyone is using a consistent approach and has the same expectations of your child. If there are two family homes, it's very important at this time that you try to stay consistent on what you're expecting your child to do. So, if they're going to a mom's house after school and the expectation is that they unpack their bag and put their lunch away, the same thing would happen when they're going to anyone else's house. Just to make sure that, that is appropriate behavior and that everyone knows that your child can do it so that they aren't able to make excuses of what they're capable of. The last topic we want to talk about in this presentation is thinking about who else would you like to share this diagnosis with. It's important to ask yourself through this process and making these decisions, is this person able to support your child better if they understand the diagnosis? So the major themes would be through school, friends, and family. And I think one of the main things to consider is to involve your child and to discuss with them who they feel comfortable in telling, as it's their own personal information. And they should feel, that this person will be able to help them in life if they are able to understand the diagnosis that they've received. Most people will react to your child's challenges, whether or not they know about a diagnosis, and it can be a difficult decision to make, who to disclose this information to. So it is something to consider, whether or not they have some of the background of what a diagnosis is. You know, some families, some schools are more aware and understanding of what some of the challenges and strengths are that are attached to a diagnosis. So those factors will play a part in determining who you tell personally and who your child feels comfortable in telling. And whether you tell some family members or all family members, again, that's all up to you. So whether or not facilitating a conversation with your child's siblings versus the extended family, you know, you really want to make those determinants. And again, as with all aspects of sharing a diagnosis with your child and other family members, these conversations can start out very small and extend to a larger group once you're more comfortable. You might find that your child does start to connect more and with the disability community and finds a way of understanding themselves when they previously didn't. And that could be the same with family members, school teachers, administration at the school, as well as their friends. If people are able to understand why some of the things that your child does are happening, they might be more accommodating and they might be able to process these things a little bit better. Peers and friends is a really hard group to disclose to. So it really would determine how your child feels about their peers knowing and weighing out the strengths of friends knowing and some potential consequences that would happen if teasing occurs. But again, slow and steady, and making sure that your child feels comfortable and that they're ready for some people in their environments to know is the first step in starting this conversation. We've come to the point in the presentation that we're going to go over a few resources around discussing a diagnosis. First, we would like you to have our work emails so that if you have any questions or comments, or you want to share where you are in this process, you can send us an email. So mine is lisa.nelson@surreyplace.ca. and Natalie is natalie.healy@surreyplace.ca. We're both happy to receive your emails and questions, and we'll be happy to get back to you if you'd like. So we've also provided a few websites here, Cars for Kids, and this is a blog about being afraid to talk about your child, about his disability. There's also some resources through PBS, as well as the book Understood. So those are some resources that you can check out in your own time. And the next page as well is different supports like Book for Siblings. And this Kathy Hoopman has All Cats Have Asperger's and All Dogs Have ADHD. They have kind of funny little stories that you and your family might enjoy. So we can leave you with those. And again, if you have any questions, please. That brings us to the end of the Discussing Your Diagnosis presentation. We want to thank you for joining us today. And again, please reach out if you have any questions or want to share any information. We really hope that wherever you are in the journey of disclosing the diagnosis to your child, that this presentation has brought you a little bit of guidance and perhaps some encouragement along the way. Good luck, and hopefully we will see you again soon at Surrey Place.